Even though I think one commonality that has stuck with me with over the last 35 years has been the fact, or it probably actually predates that, since the time I was probably in college, has been the role of software in my life. The diversity and inclusion comes to play in situations like this, where diversity of people, the inclusivity of the fact that, hey, you know what, we trust the organization, we trust the people to go work on this and come back and tell us what's the reality, is a bidirectional trust. And you don't build it when you need it, you build it ahead of time. So when situations like these arise, you're able to tap into those resources that's available to you. And these are people who have gone through a learning exercise, they know how to work together. The relevancy of you as an individual only comes in when your title and your company and your card that you have, which is not the case. Everybody is an individual. Everybody has their own professional growth, and they have their own experiences, which are extremely valuable. And then the question is, who are you? What is your brand? What do you stand for?
Hello, my listeners. Welcome back to yet another episode of Inspire Someone Today, wherein we call in inspirers to create those ripples of inspiration. Joining me today is Ramkumar Narayanan, NASSCOM Executive Council member as well as chairperson for NASSCOM Deep Tech Council. More than that, an industry veteran with over 3 decades of industry experience, a wonderful people leader, and much, much more. It's an absolute joy to have Ram joining us on this version of Inspire Someone Today. Welcome to the show, Ram.
Thanks for having me here. Thank you.
Like I mentioned, you have been in the industry, seen many versions, many parts of the industry in your long career over 3 decades, Ram. From automobile to cloud to Gen AI and much, much more. How have you seen all of these things that has evolved? What has been the hurdles that you have personally encountered along the way in this checkered career that you have had?
Yeah, well, I don't think about it as planned career, if you may, right? Some things happen for a reason. Some things happen because you want it. Some things happen because you don't. You kind of put into situations where where it happens to you. So, even though I think one commonality that has stuck with me with over the last 35 years has been the fact, or it probably actually predates that, since the time I was probably in college, has been the role of software in my life, right? In my professional life, if you may. Even though I'm a mechanical engineer, as we were chatting offline, I started my career in the auto industry, designing, my core background was in multi-body dynamics and designing suspension systems, but it was all in the using software. So in the sense that in the early part of my career, I wrote a lot of software that designed and for design and simulation of suspensions. So it was all digital, and it was a very interesting period of time. This is in the late 80s to probably the 90s, all of the 90s, where computers were being utilized for more than just some tool that people used on the side. So in the auto industry, it was becoming a lot more imperative to start to use software much more strategically rather than tactically. And the reason for that was very simple. The US auto industry was lagging behind the Japanese, and they were struggling for survival. And the only way that could come out of that, the death spiral, if you may, was to start to get a lot more efficient and in terms of shortening the time to produce a new vehicle. And there was no choice for them other than to start to use software as a mechanism. So it was an interesting time for me, as a mechanical engineer who's transitioned. And very interestingly, my final year project at a time when I was graduating from college was in a computer-aided design scenario. So, my final year project was to write a software that took essentially the ITI specifications of how to design a spur and helical gear in those days and computerize it. So the interesting part was, while our project guide during the final year of engineering was very supportive, when we actually went to the finals, round Viva and all that, defending our project, The professor was from IIT Madras, from mechanical engineering, who had no idea about software. So it was, we had to justify why we did something in software as mechanical engineers. So that was, so the reason I say that is, you know, I have seen this transition from that time till where we are today, right? And it's been a very interesting journey overall in terms of how these things are transpired. Um, Fast forward to today, right? I mean, we are talking about generative AI and a lot of new technologies. But if you look at those years, over the last 3 decades, technology has evolved, right? I mean, technology has always been evolving, and I think it's evolved faster and faster. Every wave of technology um, has kind of accelerated. I started in an era where you had to install software with diskettes on a PC. Now you tell somebody what's a diskette, and everybody kind of. I was talking to a bunch of college students the other day, and I had to tell them, that icon where you do a file save in in your software, that actually used to be a physical thing that we used to use, right? So I think we have evolved from there to the web era, to the mobile era, to where we are today. We're talking about AI, right? And I think the thing that has stood well, at least for me, is every day, you come in with a learner's mindset. You say, okay, let me not carry the biases of how I know things work, even though it's very hard sometimes to unroll it. We'll talk about this in the context of generative AI. But but there are times when you have to set aside your own biases, your own, I know this stuff, kind of thing, and say, okay, what's this? What's new about this? And what are its implications? The what and the why become much more important than the how. The how has to follow, but the what and questioning the what and the why becomes the mechanism to actually learn about new trends, new markets, new growth, all that other stuff.
And now, as you kind of look back at all of this, there's so much of wisdom that is kind of coming through that because you have kind of lived through it, experienced it, all of it. But help me understand, growing up, was this what you were kind of aspiring to be? Was this not exactly to the same shape and form, but in some way saying that, okay, this is what I aspire to become? So, how was growing up years for Ram was, and what shaped you to kind of be the professional, the person that you have shaped out to be today?
Yeah, I think my choice of mechanical engineering stemmed from that. I used to love building things. So, whether it was a mechano set to put together structures, I kind of followed diagrams, or Legos. Legos existed even when I was a kid, right? So, so I think I love building things, and I love kind of watching large machines operate and all that kind of. I also was also a little bit right-brained. I had the creative kind of a thing. I used to do a lot more sketching and kind of do those kinds of things, right? So the combination of the two became the reason why I thought design, mechanical design. I mean, in those days, the choice was either go to electrical engineering, electronics, mechanical. And mechanical was a deliberate choice for me. And I love to see large machines. I wanted to know how to design large machines. And that's what took me to mechanical engineering. So you're right, in the sense that it took me, that's one trajectory. The other one, I was a voracious reader, even as a child. Good or bad, I never constrained myself on what I read. It could be fiction, sometimes it could be non-fiction, which I couldn't understand anything, but I would still read it. And I had this notion that every book I picked up, I had to finish. So, as a lot of these things also came through, and I used to love, science fiction and kind of imagining things. One of the likes things, and that's the reason why you see so many books behind me. I'm not a big on digital reading. I read a lot, even online, but I prefer my books to be physical because I like flipping through them. I like going back. I like looking at them. I like rereading them sometimes if it interests me. So reading was always a key part of what I did, and that fired up my imagination. Everything from reading Western, like Louis L'Amour Western novels, to things fiction of all kinds, to some non-fiction. But I think that fired up my imagination in those days, right? In the sense of, as a child, in those days there was no, you can't watch TV, you didn't have all these options of watching online
That's
or
right.
TV or anything. So it was actually not a bad thing to have an imagination that says, hey, how could this have looked in those days, right? So all of this probably come together. I mean, like I like to describe everybody's life as a tapestry. That's why it's unique. It consists of threads of experiences that everybody weaves for themselves, right? So that's why no two people can ever look alike. It's very hard to copy somebody's trajectory in life ditto, because your experiences, my experiences, my cultural background, your cultural background, growing up, family, there's so many things that shapes an individual. But the strength of that individual is that shaping, right? How that comes together. So that was what growing up, and that dictated to some extent the life I've lived, right? I mean, I started off why I became an engineer, and why I stuck to engineering for a while, right? I loved machines, and the designing suspension systems was an intellectual exercise. But then software has always played a role. And after my MBA is when I transitioned to the tech arena. And that time, the 90s were a heady time, right? I mean, I described the mid 90s as what it is today with generative AI. The web was just coming up. It's not that the internet was new, but it had finally democratized itself, and consumers could start to see what it meant, right, for them. So all of that transition, keeps getting played out, right, again and again. We went through that with mobile, the advent of feature phones to smartphones and apps, and etc. That has now become such an integral part of what we are and how we operate. And I think AI is on that cusp of on that trajectory now. So that's why it's very exciting.
Absolutely. You did mention about making those shifts and the changes that is happening in the industry. And for that matter, the changes is happening across all the industry. But the quantum of change that is happening is more predominant in the IT industry. So two-part question here. One, how have you embraced some of these changes? What have you kind of seen coming in, and how have you kind of readjusted yourself to these changes happening in the industry? Two, as a leader, it's just not only you adjusting to the change, but rallying your organization, your teams to embrace that particular
Yeah,
change. So, how have you kind of straddled that particular piece as
yeah.
well?
So look, I mean, every shift in technology and has been um, seismic in some sense, right? Over all these years, the way I think I would describe this is the shifts in technology happen faster for a reason because the adoption curve reduces, with every shift that happens. It took a long time for 100 million people to start using the internet. It took a few weeks for 100 million people to start using ChatGPT. So I think the shift are happening faster and faster, and that's just because the avenues for people to experience it are accelerating. So that's one side to it. The other side to it is I've been fortunate enough, I personally, to having worked for the last 23 years for some iconic technology company. After the auto industry, after my MBA, I joined Microsoft at a very interesting period of time when Microsoft, was itself going through a lot of changes internally in terms of how it was starting to view it, its role in the larger industry. Followed by a Yahoo, which was an aging internet giant, but it still had a lot of interesting assets and a lot of interesting future in terms of user base and how it was transacting. So it was a massive learning experience for me to work for a company like that, even though the company itself was on its downward swing during that period of time. But that also was even more challenging because trying to maintain the company's position in the market at a time when it was getting a lot of other challenges was an interesting proposition. From there, I went on to eBay, which was in the e-commerce space, and it taught me a lot. I managed a global team focusing on what we call the monetization platforms and set up the India Center for them. So it was a dual kind of a challenge where we were setting up the center in India, and I was managing a global team on the heart and soul of how eBay made its money, right? And at a time when India was going through its e-commerce revolution, right? If you look back in time, that's the time when e-commerce is really kind of starting to take off in India. So the interplay of all of this is very interesting. And now, of course, with VMware, it takes me back into the enterprise space where I was during Microsoft days. And for the last 5.5 years, it's been a blast taking the India Center for VMware to its next level. With its people, that's where the people angle comes in, and looking at it from the larger industry and context and the role that the company was, focused on in terms of the global charter, as well as how the India Center was playing its role in all of that. So the long answer to the short question was technology trends during this time was very interesting to track and be part of, right? Whether it's in India or otherwise. So that's the other angle for me, other than my day jobs and professional experience of companies I work for. I've been involved in the Indian ecosystem for a very long time. You mentioned my NASCOM, role right now, but I've been working in the Indian ecosystem. I moved back to India in 2005, 18 years ago. But for the last 16, 17 years, I've been involved at many levels in the larger product ecosystem in India and its evolution. So I've seen that grow in parallel as well to a lot of the other things that have happened. But what that has allowed us to do, or allowed me to do, is bring the market trends into the organizational growth and challenges, right, that come in. So that's where the people angle. How do you kind of look at melding, helping people understand what is happening in the market, what is happening in the company, how do these two things matter to each, how do they work together, and hence what is their role in the organization. So transitioning from kind of the technology trends and my experience with that to how do you look at organizations and leading organizations through these kinds of changes, right, that happen. First of all, I think it starts with trust. That organization needs to have, the people in the organization need to have trust in the organization. And the organization needs to build a trust in the people, right? I mean, it's a bi-directional trust building exercise. And that starts with relationships. It starts with understanding and hearing what people are really kind of wanting to do, where is their aspirations, and linking that to what the company wants to do, right? And be able to do that effectively is, I think, and I don't think it, first of all, I think the top down, command and control model is dead, right? As a leader, you have to understand you cannot operate in that model anymore. And the more you operate, the more chafing that happens. And every younger generation, every next generation that comes up, moves further and further away from you if you try to do that model. And we've seen examples of this in the market, right? Where command and control, people trying to impose will on others, it just doesn't work. I mean, the reaction to that is not great, right? So trust building is a bi-directional exercise and it needs to be done. So that's one. Second is you need, like I said, be able to effectively link what people are doing with their day job to what is happening in the company, to what is happening in the market. You need to have that ability to connect that viewpoint, right? Because without that, it's a people look at it as a job, right? I mean, I get paid to do what I do. It's a it's a 9 to 5. Somebody tells me what to do, I go do it. In the tech sector, you cannot operate that way. A lot of organizations still do, unfortunately, but you cannot operate that way. If you want to build an effective, global ready organization, you have to be able to effectively link the role of everybody in the organization. It's not about just engineers or not. Every single person in that organization needs to be effectively be able to say, my role is this, and here's why I do it. Right. So if you can do that effectively, I think you start to build the foundation of a strong organization. Then you have to be able to link people to their growth. No organization. I mean, you mentioned that technology organizations are the ones which are seeing a lot of change. I actually disagree with that, unfortunately, because every organization is seeing change. Technology, in your role, I'm sure you see this on a daily basis. Technology is a non sequitur now in any company. I mean, it doesn't matter what organization, what function you're in. Technology is going to play a big role in what you do, and it's going to have a disruptive effect on you if you're not focused on it, right? In terms of its implications for your business. So every organization needs to be able to look at it from this lens and be able to connect that back and make people comfortable. I mean, some organizations it'll be disruptive because it's actually we're talking about some of these new technologies replacing people. It may not happen at the scale that is being feared, but but change is non-negotiable at this point. So getting people ready, capability, helping them build capabilities that will help them mitigate those kinds of changes that is happening in their life. And some of that capability building can be formal learning. Obviously companies have these kind of L&D programs, but a lot of it happens because of peer learning. Can you create avenues for people to come together and solve problems in a way in which they can learn doing that? See, that also reduces the fear because people are learning it not in the context of, hey, I have to protect my job, but they do it in the context of saying, look, I'm learning something new by doing this, and hence I'm getting better at what I do, right? And be able to do that kind of stuff.
Mhm. But when you say peer learning, is it like doing projects together? Is it working on initiatives which is beyond what you do on a day in day out basis?
That is correct. That is correct. Yeah,
Okay.
because it's some of it will come back to your day job because you just kind of learn something new to bring it back. But a lot of it is what you suggest, right? Which is, can you create communities of people, project teams? Can you open up avenues for them? So as a leader, you have to kind of start to watch for those kinds of opportunities that come up. One example of this is when generative AI came up a year ago, right? It didn't matter whether you work for a technology company or a non-technology company. Suddenly, this thing was in everybody's hands, and everybody had to understand how does this have a meaning, right? A technology company had to figure out, hey, what does this mean for my customers and what does it mean for my products that I'm going to sell to them? For the customer side, it was, hey, what is this thing? How do I need to make sense out of it? Every boardroom discussion was that, right? Well, am I going to be get hit by the tsunami called generative AI that's going to come in effectively. So even if you are an advertising company, you have to figure out what the hell was this, and how do I make sense out of it? How do I can I use it? Can I not use it? Is it going to come and destroy my business? Everybody started talking about it. So I think that is a great opportunity, to take your some of your brightest people and say, look, come together. Let's go do an exercise. Let's create a project, set of projects that will let you go test it out, let you go do this, and then you come back and tell us how does this work. So it doesn't need to be that the management needs to sit in its ivory tower and say, oh, what does this mean to me? It says include the organization in this point. This is where my point about trust comes in. If I, as a leader, trust my organization, trust the people that I have there, and those people say, yeah, you know what, the leader is asking us, or the management team is asking us to go off and work on this project. I know that they are willing to back me up on this when it comes back. They are not going to kind of, throw it under the rug. If it's inconvenient, they are willing to do this. Now, suddenly that trust building exercise that I said was a foundational element starts to play a role now in terms of how you
Yeah.
help people get through this, right? And anytime you do inclusive exercises with your people, this is not a slogan to do, diversity and inclusion. The diversity and inclusion comes to play in situations like this, where diversity of people, the inclusivity of the fact that, hey, you know what, we trust the organization, we trust the people to go work on this and come back and tell us what's the reality, is a bidirectional trust. And you don't build it when you need it, you build it ahead of time. So when situations like these arise, you're able to tap into those resources that's available to you. And these are people who have gone through a learning exercise. They know how to work together. They're good at picking up an open-ended problem and working on it. And it doesn't matter which part of the organization they come from. You could be in finance, you could be in marketing, you could be in engineering, you could be in, real estate, right? You could be managing the real estate portfolio. But these are all bright people. And the more you can trust them to come together and solve larger problems for the organization, the better off you are as a company.
Great. So there is trust, there is clarity, there is focus on individual development, which helps one to kind of embrace whatever change is coming in their way.
And
Added
there's
to that,
inclusivity.
Ram,
Sorry, I was just one last thing
inclusivity.
not to lose sight of is inclusivity, because I think the inclusiveness happens is where I think the strength of the organization comes.
And Ram, one of the piece that has happened while we talk about change, there's also some bit of cacophony around it, right? So, couple of years back, there was RPA, automation, metaverse, now Gen AI.
Yeah.
God knows what's next. As a leader, how do you kind of set yourself away from the noise and focus on what needs to be focused?
As an individual, you're asking, or as an organization?
Both, both.
Okay.
What is
So
your
I think,
tips for people listening to it so that they can kind of cut the noise? And as a leader, what do you kind of guide other leaders to do?
yeah, I think that just comes from, being involved, right? At some point, you start to say, okay, I can't be in everything. I'm not a big fan of boiling the ocean. I mean, yes, there is a lot coming at you, and it is noisy, it's messy. There's all kinds of schools of thought. All that happens. But some of this starts with saying, developing your own capabilities to analyze situations, right? And maybe, my background, and this is where I think I would suggest that my MBA helped. Right? I mean, of course, I'm not saying MBA is the only avenue to do this, but when I did my MBA as an engineer, I transitioned to becoming a management person, and I think the biggest thing that helped me was how to analyze situations, how to break down a problem, how to look at like I go back to this point I made about what and the why. So, irrespective of what that noise is, it gives me a framework. I mean, it works for me. I'm not saying it works for everybody. It gives me a framework to say, is this of interest to me? Is this of any implication to me personally? Does it give me a new avenue, a new tool, a new, out thing that will help me in my role that I do? And also in the people that I work with, is there a way for me to explain to them how to look at this, right? So some of this is just kind of leading a diverse perspective on the topic, and some of it is. I mean, I'll give you one example: crypto. I still today I don't. While I'm sure there's a lot of people who are experts on crypto, and they know it very well. I, for one, never resonated with it. I mean, it's one of those things. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying, for me personally, the whole Web3 and NFTs and all the crypto thing that was making the rounds and a lot of noise around it, it didn't make me wake up. and say, look, this is something that I need to dig in and kind of get and become, much better and understanding of it. Yes, I understand. I took the time to read through it in terms of kind of following what it was doing, but it never really kind of. But whereas when I saw ChatGPT, okay, I mean, AI has been in that, ever since, I don't know, 50, 60 years, 70 years, AI has always been taught. And there's been a lot of movement on AI. I mean, machine learning and AI. As a technology and industry leader, I've always been tracking ML, for example. Every company I work for has always had some element of, using machine learning for solving their business problems. But when ChatGPT first, when I saw it in November, it launched last November. I think I saw it being launched, and I said, okay, what is this? And I used it the day after it was launched. That was my first foray. It said, for me, it was wow. Okay. Not because it was producing poetry on one end and was able to do other things, right? Maybe it was just, my own bias. So this is where I think the bias aspects kicks in. To me, the feeling I got was when I saw the Mosaic browser for the first time in probably the mid 90s. And I was using links in, the early days of the internet. Links had launched already. So it was basically a text-based ability to browse the web. So you type in command line prompts to actually browse the web, right? The first foray. But when the Mosaic browser was released by UIUC, and I was working in the auto industry, and the company I was at, Ford, and Ford was actually quite liberal about allowing the people working there to use the internet on the company, access to the internet. So we were able to download the Mosaic browser and pull it up. And I was like, and I, the URL that I was browsing using my uh, links browser, I typed it into the bar, and the page showed up, right? So hey, what is this thing, right? What is HTTP? How
Magic.
do you build this? How do you start building a web page? And and I think to me, when I use ChatGPT for the first time, I think that's the kind of the mental model that suddenly popped in my head. Hey, this thing is now useful. Okay, and now it is going to get democratized. Now every individual. So it's no longer about a small group of people who know about AI or machine learning, or who are very good at doing this, taking large amounts of data and training it to get results. It is suddenly in the hands of people. And once that genie is out of the bottle, it's very hard to put that back in. And now this could be, it's a wide implication, a wide variety of people could start using it. And it happened, right? Within, that's why it reached a million, I think within the first 2, 3 days. And then it reached 100 million, the fastest ever for any technology to get adopted at that scale, other than threads. But that was a bit of a cheating by Meta when they launched threads on top of Instagram, right? But so I would discount that a bit. But so suddenly it woke up everybody's imagination of what is possible. And frankly, the hype curve went through that at a much faster pace than what internet did. I mean, in the late 90s, that's why the whole internet bubble, kind of grew, right, in the late 90s, was because every business was suddenly an internet business. Everybody was doing it. What later became IoT was being discussed in the late 90s. The refrigerators talking to the internet, which will order your, groceries for you automatically. These use cases were being discussed, in the late 90s. So, but the thing is, this had the propensity for that at a much faster pace because everybody had a phone in their hand. They could start using it. So, what I was trying to tell you is that is my personal filtering that says, hey, you know what? This technology, it could be useful for others. It doesn't resonate with me. And this thing does. And for me, then the question is, what does it mean for the business that I work for or where I work in and the people around me? How can I explain it to them? And sometimes I don't need to explain it, right? This is where I think I said, let others who are better than you, who are smarter than you, go and play at it and come back and tell you what it's like. So it's also an aspect of saying, I don't have all the answers. And there are people who are better than me at going and finding these answers.
Mhm.
Can you bring them into the tent and have them go do this and learn from that? Because that gives you the diversity and the variety of that could potentially come back at you. And then you look at it and go, okay, wow, it can do this. That's interesting. What more can it do? And I think that's how I learn, and that's how I look at technology trends.
Yeah. I think the uh, other side on elements to that is having that curiosity and having that ability to learn from other sources as well, multiple sources. Just not
Yeah,
what I learn is how I interpret it, but what and where I learn from. and whom I learn from.
Yeah, the way I describe that is you need to have a point of view. You need to develop a point of view, but hold it lightly. Right? You need to have a
Mhm.
strong point of view, but hold it lightly, and be ready to change it, throw it out the door, and reframe it, rethink it. Because I think the point you're making about curiosity and all that, it is about developing a point of view. Curiosity is not just about kind of poking at things and say walking away. Right? It's also about saying, okay, what does this mean? Why would it be important for me? The how is later, right? I mean, the how we'll get to. But how is part of how you kind of kick the tires. You get your hands dirty, get going. Right? So, but I think that's the important part of developing a point of view is start with curiosity. Secondly, it starts with curiosity, but it rapidly transitions to saying, what does this mean for me or people who I work with or I live with, people around me, and then form a point of view and then test it out, right? And I'm very not shy about espousing my point of view, and it's okay, right? Because people will poke back at me or show me the mirror or and do all that. As long as they're doing it from the right intent and they're doing it with the right their point of view, there is a learning opportunity for both parties, and so there is no ego in this, right? And that,
Yeah. And talking about point of view, Ram, you have a point of view on building portfolio careers. Tell us a bit more about that point of view and why is it more important in the world that we are in today?
yeah, I mean, in some ways I wish I had learned it, but if I look back on my life, right, I've always had a portfolio in some sense. I didn't call it that. I didn't even know it was called that until I met one of my mentors who framed it so nicely and wrote a book around it. But I think the innate curiosity, kicking the tires all the time. So even when I was in college a student, or I was in the workforce, I've always kept side projects, right? Whether it is more formal or informal, I've always had things going on, multiple things going on in my life. I mean, there was obviously a primary one which paid my bills and gave me a salary and all that kind of stuff. But I've always been a fan of trying out multiple things, all the time. Just keep something boiling, right? Some areas of interest boiling for me personally. So I have side projects and I have things that I do. That has helped me be able to weather changes that have come up also. Not everything that happens in your personal or professional life is always up and to the right? I mean, there's always challenges that come up. But I think what has helped me mitigate that is that, right? Having those other avenues, having, relationships with people, networks that I can tap into, talk to, right? Not build those networks when I needed them, but when I didn't need them, so that I can tap into them when I needed to get answers or have somebody go talk to when things change, right? So I think that's a very important thing that everybody needs. I wish I had learned this earlier in my life in some ways. Right? How do you build these networks and things? But nevertheless, I think it's an important piece, and that allows you to then start to examine options in front of you. When things change, right? And so I don't know if I want to call it a portfolio life, but keeping those different avenues active is important. And even today, even at this stage, I do my day job and have that, but I also do a lot of other things in the ecosystem. I get involved with it, which gives me a set of perspectives which I don't get by just working for one company, because it opens me up to a diverse set of people and thoughts and ideas. And it gives me another avenue to work with other people on, right, in the ecosystem. And for that, I have to say that first of all, I'm very fortunate to have that opportunity, and some of it is serendipity. I didn't ask for some things, but they came my way, and the question is, are you open to take grabbing those when they come by, or do you turn everything off, turn everything away, saying no, this is what I do, and that's all I describe. I hold myself in a very rigid framework. I don't. You can call it whatever you like, but that's
Yeah.
how I think.
And the combination of having that portfolio career, portfolio life to designing something like a gap year. You hear about gap years more in the universities, more a Western concept, but it's soon catching up over here as well. It's no longer taboo. I think gap year is seen more constructively, more positively. Like you said, people use this as an opportunity to build those portfolio careers, to build other avenues than what was possible earlier on. So your take on gap year, you yourself had a gap year, so your learnings from it and your take on How is it important? Is it important? And what time in somebody's career can one consider this?
Yeah. So in my case, it was thrust upon me in some sense, right? I was working for eBay, and it was in the end of 2016. eBay decided to exit India, and uh, and so the choice in front of me was not too many options. And when they exited India, they sold off the business. They exited the development center. So it was, in some ways, it was thrust upon me. And at that time, I had been working for about close to 30 years, 28 years or so. And I had never taken a break. I mean, I've done my own entrepreneurial gigs. I've worked for companies, but all of these was one continuum, right? There was almost no break in it, right? Where it just went one after the other. When this came up, to some extent, it was that was where I think my support system helped me, because it was a chance to go and talk to a set of people to say, hey, you know what, this is coming up. How do I deal with this? How do I think about this? And I got very good advice from a number of people, but it was not the same advice. Different people, talked about it in different ways. Some people had been through this kind of challenges. They said, look, there's always a life after this. So don't get so caught up in it that, you don't see other options in front of you. Some people said, you know what, it's a great opportunity for you to take a step back and decide what you want to do next. Of course, some people said, oh, don't take a career break. You may not be able to come back into the workforce. Yeah. In India, particularly, it is not looked, a gap in your resume is not looked upon kindly. And so I got a variety of offer things. But it was nice because some of these people also came up and said, hey, look, I'm looking for some help. Would you be interested in coming and working with me on something? Right. So what I landed up was, while I decided that, okay, you know what, I'm not in any hurry to get back into the workforce. And some of it was also because, you know, that experience I had working for that organization at the time, I had set up their presence in India, and then I had to shut it down. So it was, as a professional, it's quite traumatic. A lot of people only talk about the things that they build, right? And I'm a builder, right? Don't get it wrong. But I was also put into a situation where I had to now close it down. And that is sometimes, as a professional, it hits you, right? The aspect of saying, hey, you know what happened here? Was it my fault? I was the leader, right? At the end of the day, everybody looks to you. Did I do something wrong? Was it, but what I think some other well wishers told me is, don't take it so personally. Sometimes things happen for you which is beyond your control. Be able to differentiate and let go. If it is not, you have to be very clear about what's in your circle of influence and circle of decision making. Some things are not, and don't make that a personal thing. And I think that was great advice. And all of this combination of things, allowed me to say, look, I want to go do a bunch of things. Let me go try out a few things and see what happens. And that became a 1.5 year journey. And while it was not, but what that allowed me to do was, one, get back to things I love doing. I'm a last 23 years, if somebody asks me, what are you at your core? I say I'm a product leader, right? I'm a product manager, an engineer turned product manager, turned a person who builds organizations and matures organizations. So the heart of it was that. And this allowed me to go and work with some, startup companies and help them with product strategy. It allowed me to go work with a large Indian conglomerate on a division of theirs that they had recently acquired, and they're trying to, put a digital strategy around it. So, and then I worked with a couple of others on some consulting projects. So it suddenly allowed me to get back to doing things, to get over what I call the toxicity of large organizations. Because the higher you are up in an organization, the less you do on a day-to-day basis, right? I'm not saying you're wasting your time, but your ambit of control reduces dramatically, right? You don't do things anymore. You tell people to do something, and they go off and
Right.
do it. You delegate, right? I mean, obviously, you hold the bigger picture in your mind, but you're no longer hands-on as much as somebody with the name, which is the need of the organization. It's nothing wrong. That's what it is. But this gave me a chance to step back and try to get back to doing things on that, and also get back to things that I found joy to doing that. But the side, one of the big things that happened, not a side, it's one of the core things that happened. It also helped me refine in my own mind what I really liked doing at this stage of my life. Where is it that I brought the maximum amount of value to people? And that defined. So when I joined VMware 5.5 years ago, I had a fair amount of clarity in my mind. Why would I take a role with another large company? Okay, when I was coming out of a one and a half
A
year
large
break,
company.
Yeah. And so there was a fair amount of clarity in my mind why I was taking the job. And right through the last 5.5 years, that part of it has stayed constant. Okay. Why I took the job, why that particular organization, and why is it that it has reached a stage now where, okay, it may be potentially time to move on. And that clarity, I think, in my mind, emerged during that break because it allowed me to try out different things. It allowed me to say, okay, otherwise what happens is you're very confused. Too many things are crowding around you, and you tend to do a knee-jerk reaction of, hey, you know what, I need to do something now. You get into a little bit of a panic mode of saying, I can't be idle, right? I have to find my next job. I need to do this. But this allowed me to discover that part. So I think that was to me the biggest thing, and it also made me comfortable with the fact that I can operate without an identity that is tied to an organization.
I think that detachment is very profound, right?
It is. It is. I mean, you'll be very surprised. I mean, I don't know, Shrikant, if you've taken a break in your career, but if somebody asks you, what do you do? What your first answer is, I am this title at this
Your
company.
title.
Whatever. Your title, your company, that associate, and that's what the society, the social network around you, the physical social network around you expects. They want you to have that title. The relevancy of you as an individual only comes in by your title and your company and your card that you have, which is not the case. Everybody is an individual. Everybody has their own professional growth, and they have their own experiences which are extremely valuable. And then the question is, who are you? What is your brand? What do you stand for? And a lot of times as professionals, we don't get the time to sit back and make that, understand that. People think they do, but still they fall back on their professional title and all that kind of stuff. To me, that was the hardest thing to unwind after almost 30 years of work. I've always had that, right? I mean, I always had a badge, whether it was my own. I was an entrepreneur for about 7 years, and that was still my company. But that was my identity was tied to that, or to any of the other companies that I worked for. So this allowed me to separate the two. Yes, my relevancy, my in certain situations may come from my role, my position, my title, my company that I work for. But hold that lightly, because that's not, it's likely to change. It is not a constant. It's not a given. And I think
Hmm.
it's important for everybody to understand what is the value that they bring to the table for themselves. What's their brand? Or how do they handle themselves? A lot of times they say culture is when nobody, how you behave when nobody's looking at you. And I think it becomes even more stark when you step back from a corporate role of many years. So all of that was helpful. This kind of a break was helpful in helping Frank. It also helped me discover what I did well. You know, One of the things I discovered working with startups is while I can bring value to them at some level, a lot of it is I come from a perspective and a point of view which may be more applicable to a company that's not in a very early stage of its life.
Which is more mature.
Yeah, I had to adapt for that, right? Because sometimes your expectations of what when you're working with somebody is, hey, why is this person not even thinking this way? And you have to step back and say, that's not where they are in their trajectory. You have to calibrate for it. It allowed me to do that, but it also allowed me to say, look, my strength is in building or turning around large organizations. And that's okay. Both can exist, both can coexist. But if I were to spend a majority of my time on something, where would I be most effective? And that was, in my mind, it was still in a larger organization, right? Where I could bring a different perspectives. I had the resources to work with. I had the, resources to mold at one level and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not, when people ask me, oh, do you miss doing another startup? I don't. Because I get that by working with a lot of, really energetic and bright founders who are doing the right thing for themselves and helping them at one. But at a personal level, I'm still a large company guy. My strength is orchestrating large companies, right? And be able to take them to the next level or turn things around or take an existing business and kind of reframe it in a new direction. So I've built V1, I've built turnarounds, I've done turnarounds. So I'm comfortable doing that. The break allowed me to step back and say, okay, here are the things that I'm good at. Here's where I think rest. Here's where I want to spend the rest of my time. And how do I bring value to the larger organizations and to the ecosystem? So that's another non-negotiable, right? That for myself is I will doesn't matter what my next role is, where I go next, or what I do next. That element of ecosystem, working with the larger ecosystem and shaping it will continue, right? Whatever shape or form. as the situation demands. So I think the broader piece allowed me of taking that sabbatical, taking the break, allowed me to do a few things. Get comfortable with myself. Take all my other background experiences and bring it together and say, what is it that I want to do next? It allowed me to get back to saying, you know what, I can operate as an individual contributor if need be. I can run large organizations if I want. So that opens up and it frees you up to think about things, other opportunities in very different ways. And the other piece is continuing to build your relationships with people, continuing to deepen that. See, at the end of the day, we can look back on our careers. We don't remember most of the work that we did, most of the projects that we worked on, but we do remember the people that we
The people
met,
we
good and
work
bad.
with. Absolutely. I think that level of clarity is what helps you to kind of move forward as well, because you're clear in your mind saying that what is it you would want to do. I think to round off this, we talked about portfolio careers, we talked about gap year. You did mention about the importance of going and talking to people. In some ways, I'll
Yeah.
call it as mentors, coaches, or whatever you would want to label them as. Your word of advice to lot many people looking for mentoring support is, what are those three or four critical ingredients to make mentoring successful? It's not about go seek a mentor. I think that is something that's very much out there. But where I see people not taking the full advantage of having that mentor is what to ask. How do you prepare to kind of, so in your own experience, Ram, how can one maximize the mentoring relationship?
See, there are different kinds of people. There are givers, there are takers, and there are some who do both. Right? To me, I think I'm. It's not a judgment thing, but takers generally are out looking for answers for themselves. But when the shoe's on the other foot, you don't find them anywhere. Givers are good souls who will give irrespective of what the situation is or who they're dealing with. Right? I mean, they're very good at that. But to me, I think the most effective relationship is one which is symbiotic. Okay. Um, so approaching, so I before you get into mentors or non-mentors and all that kind of stuff, I think the question is, how are you building a relationship with another person? Okay. What can you contribute to the dialogue that the other person can learn from as much as you want to learn from? Okay. And even as a lot of people obviously approach me to help, to mentor them or whatever. But to me, I do a bit of a touchstone on this, to understand. I can certainly contribute to them. Obviously, otherwise they're not going to approach me. But what can I learn from the other person? How can they contribute to me? Right? It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter your experience. There is always a learning that comes out of it. In fact, I enjoy, I meet when I spend time with new college grads in my organization, not just when they get hired, but also, kind of work, stay in touch with them during their first few years of professional life. I do that not because it's a nice thing to do. I do that because there's some learning that comes to me also. Because there's a fresh perspectives that come in. I mean, it's always refreshing to deal with kids who are fearless when they walk into your office and tell you that, hey, you're doing something wrong. You're not thinking about this. So so I think a good effective mentor-mentee relationship starts with a relationship building exercise where both sides can say, hey, you know what can I learn from you? What can you learn from me? Okay. Then it opens up a much more effective future relationship with that person. And you may not tap into them all the time. But when the need arises, it doesn't start from a dialogue of, hey, I want mentorship. It starts from a thing saying the comfort level builds, which says, hey, you know what, so and so, I need your help. Here's where I'm struggling. Okay. And the barriers come down. So for an effective mentor-mentee relationship, those barriers have to come down. So again, it goes back to my point earlier on about relationship and trust. Because once if those build, the conversation becomes easy, right? It also becomes much more natural in terms of how you engage with someone and do that. So I think that's the way I think about it. So any relationship that is a give and take, it'll always make for a good mentor-mentee relationship.
Okay, there you go. Thank you so much on that. So, Ram, we have been talking a lot about your career journey, some learnings out of it. We'll slip into a segment where I call this as a power of three round. Well, we'll start off with something that you're very, very passionate about. I can see the library right behind you. So I'll start off with three book recommendations that had an impact on you.
Shika, that's the hardest thing to do. It's like asking you which your left eye or right eye is the most effective. I don't know if I can pick out one or two
Or
things.
to
There'll
make
be
it
books,
easy, if we were to say 2023 book recommendations, what you have read in 23, if you can give us three from that list.
I'm currently reading a book on happiness, and the idea is that there's always this thought that achievement then drives happiness, right? You achieve something and then you derive happiness out of it, success in career or whatever it is. And this is a theory that's flipped it on its head that says, you know what, happiness precedes success. If you are comfortable with yourself, and all the things I just talked about, and I learned this later in life, in some sense, right? Where once I started getting more comfortable with who I am, in my relationships with my family or with my, network, it allowed me to become, in my mind, more successful for myself. Okay. I think that's the theory of this book. And not a very big book. Somebody gave it to me as a gift. I have been, I just started reading the Elon Musk biography by, Walter Isaacson. The other book that I read by Walter Isaacson was the Code Breakers.
Okay.
It's about the whole mRNA and the gene sequencing and its avenues. It was eye opening for me. I mean, I did last time I did biology was in high school
Mm-hmm.
when I in my 12th standard, but I had moved far away from biology. But this kind of piqued my interest coming out of the pandemic and everything else in terms of looking at how that whole thing evolved. You know, Again, this is another of those technologies which was on the periphery, right? I mean, the whole gene sequencing thing and everything else was happening during the 80s and 90s, and I was in the US in those days, so it was happening. You could see it kind of playing itself out, but you didn't pay attention to it. But now, with my interest in deep tech, which we didn't talk about as much, you know, these kinds of cross pollination of various disciplines is starting to get more and more important. So I'm now trying to educate myself in some of those fields, starting to read, being engaged with, as part of NASCOM, we have a number of community groups, one of which is a health tech group. There's a bunch of doctors in it, so and a bunch of technologists in it. So, I am a lurker there. I kind of sit and I read, I watch these dialogues happening, but it's very eye opening, right? Where you have doctors and physicians and people on the ground who work with patients on a daily basis, sitting on one island. And then you have technologists who are bursting at the seams with new ideas sitting on another island. If you build a bridge and you start to see how the cross pollination starts to happen and ideas start to flow, and learning starts to happen, from each other's perspective, it's actually fascinating to watch. So we're doing that.
Three pieces of advice that has helped you in your long career.
Yeah, I think one starts with saying get comfortable with who you are. And I think that's many people have told me in the past, but until I took the time to do it, I think it was game changing for me personally. God, let me get more comfortable. Second is, one of my mentors asked me, "What hobbies do you have?" At a time when I was struggling with my professional, just commitments. Okay, and it was a very interesting question because as a growing up, I had a lot of other, I used to play sports, doing a bunch of other things. Somewhere in my professional journey, those things had dropped off. And I still read, I did all that, but that was not a hobby. Okay. And it was a wake up call because while I listened to music, I never really learned to play instruments or learned music formally. Or I used to potter around with sketching and all that, but I moved away from that. So a lot of the things that you would do outside of your work, I mean, some people are lucky enough that they have stayed with it. For me, that was a wake up call. Okay. So I said, okay, now let me step back and say this is during that time I took my sabbatical as well. What kind of things interest you anymore, and how do you kind of still stay with it? So I think that's the second thing is hobbies and things that you do outside of your professional work. And partly for me, I think engaging with the ecosystem is also a bit of a hobby. It has become that way. So that's the second thing that came up. Third is health. The wake up call of you, as they say, things that are easy to ignore are the ones that you ignore first. And it's a bit of a wake up call about a few years ago where well wishers and my doctor, my family doctor, said, "Hey, you know what? I don't think you're looking at the things that you should be focused on from a health perspective as you're starting to age, get a little older." So I think that's been the other wake up call. Third one is on the health front. Are you eating right? Are you doing the right thing? From an exercise perspective, and then mental health. I think the pandemic also has brought to light that it's not just about physical health that you need to focus on. It's also about
Right.
your mental health and getting comfortable. So I think those would be the three things.
Yep. So we will not be able to do justice by not talking about deep tech. So we'll have to have a separate conversation around that. But one thing I'll ask you about,
More than happy.
that again in the power of three round is what are the three deep tech companies or startups to watch out for?
Yeah, I don't want to single them out because that'd be unfair to all the others. I'll tell you where some of the interesting areas are coming up
Okay.
and people can do their own, implications of this. I think health is definitely a big area of emerging. I think Indian companies, Indian startups, there are a number of them which are emerging in that space, or some of them are scaling, solving some really deep problems. I mean, it's everything from cancer detection and reading MRIs to health to of heart and everything else. That's one. There are companies which are coming up solving some deep problems in the incurable bacteria space. Right? These are not companies you would have associated from Indian origin, but they are now stepping onto the world stage and solving these kinds. So health is definitely a big area emerging. Energy and climate tech. Some very interesting companies that are coming up in that space, which are solving problems, and whether it is as simple as, hey, you know what, urban technologies to solve some of the problems for India, which are also useful in other parts of the world, to solving problems in energy, in battery technologies. Of course, I would put aspects of EV as part of the climate area, but even more than that, right? Solving problems in pollution, in air pollution, air tracking, all that kind of stuff. So climate tech is another which has a direct implication from a social perspective. The third area is on mobility, and mobility in a broad sense, whether it is space tech, whether it is terrestrial, autonomous vehicles, robots, whether they are drones, drone technologies, either hovering in the air or going underwater. Some very interesting companies that are coming up in that space. I mean, I'm only picking three, whereas agri-tech and all these other things that come up. But the thing that I love about deep tech, and I just touch upon this, we can always have a deeper conversation, and why it has now, made me a believer as well as a proponent of it, if you're an evangelist for it, is because other technologies, and it's not to say others don't have societal impact. I think societal impact of deep tech is a lot deeper and more ingrained. In a world that is rapidly becoming, highly populated, huge amount of climate change driven by, various factors, and we need to find other avenues to live to how the world would look like 100 years from now. And that's where deep tech comes together because it has a societal impact, it has a technology impact, it has the cross pollination of bringing together multiple disciplines as they have evolved. And how do you kind of bring them together into a much more effective solutions
And at
for
scale.
the market and at scale? Absolutely. I mean, we are at about 8 billion population,
Yeah.
right? Think about it. The world has never seen this. We have to feed them, they have to have a livelihood, they have to have so many implications. And then, of course, there's also proponents that the Earth is, we have outlived the Earth. We need to find other avenues in space, colonization of Mars or wherever, right? So, so, so I think this is where deep tech all comes together, and that's one reason why, while AI is important and it's very interesting, AI just become foundation layer for deep tech. Just the way I think about this is AI by itself is useful and helpful, but to me, the AI becomes, instead of a vertical, it's a horizontal. It is going to power the next generation of deep tech and societal impact in all these various domains that I know. And that's what, keeps me going now.
Great. Like I said, we had to do a full episode only on deep tech. So we'll definitely come back to you on that, Ram. The last of the power of three round question here. What are three micro experiments that you can recommend for our listeners?
One is, I think, if you have not yet started playing with generative AI, please get started, because it's going to have an implication for everybody, and it's getting more and more easily available. Uh, you know, so that every consumer can get access to. Second, I think you need to get much more savvy about cybersecurity in the context of evolving AI and everything else. Because it's a consumer problem. It is no longer an enterprise problem. It's no longer everything else. It's a consumer problem, and you just have to open the newspaper on a daily basis and see, every the bad guys are always two steps ahead of the good guys, right? So get a lot more savvy about technology, irrespective of who you are, at what age you are. You may choose not to use it. That's okay, but you're going to get touched by it whether you like it or not. So it's no longer okay for people to, take it for granted that cybersecurity is somebody else's problem. It's not yours. That's the second thing. Second area. It's not a micro experiment in the way you define it, but get a lot more savvy about what these things are and how it's influenced. Third is, get out of your silo if you're sitting in a silo. Get out, build relationships with people, get to know people who are not like you. And it is hard sometimes for people, right? Because they are very much straitjacketed. I don't have time. The biggest refrain I hear from people is, I'm so busy in my life that I don't have time. I would push against that, because yes, I'm not saying I can't. Obviously, everybody has their life to live, but it is not hard to carve out 5%, 10% of your time for yourself. Okay? Irrespective of who you are, it's not a gender thing. It's irrespective of who you are, irrespective of what you do, right? Whether you're a professional, non-professional, whatever you are, take some time, even if it's 10% of your time, to do something outside of your norm. Get to know some people outside of your. Try to get involved in some thing outside of things that you do on a day-to-day basis. Even if it's a social circle, it's okay. Get out of that. And irrespective of age, it's not an age thing. There's some great work happening nowadays on helping senior citizens get connected back into social circles. Because as you age, it gets harder and harder to form new relationships. And there are some really good organizations that are coming up that are starting to connect people who are retired, who are older, who are more lonely, to social circles where they can find people of similar bandwidth and wavelength. And it has been known, if you've watched the Blue Zones episodes or read about it, you see that social network is a key part of longevity.
And the recent WHO thing is loneliness is called as the next biggest threat to mankind.
I saw that. 70, and there is a flipping point between loneliness and being comfortable with being alone.
Right.
I think it's at some 65% or 75% or something of the time. If you're lonely, if you're alone, then suddenly it flips over into becoming loneliness. It is important, and societal norms are changing, right? And particularly also in India, and so I think it's important for people to be, irrespective of what age you are, starting to experiment with building that groups of people around you, beyond that. I think that's very critical going.
Great call out there, Ram. Ram, I would love to continue this conversation for a lot more time. This has been just one fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Before we wrap up, this show is all about creating ripples of inspiration. What is your Inspire Someone Today message to all the listeners out there?
Step out and do something different.
Okay. Can't re-emphasize more. Step out, do something different. Break the status quo. Go out there, do something else. On that note, Ram, thank you so much for sharing your life journey, career journey with me and my listeners. Appreciate your time. Thank you for listening into today's edition of Inspire Someone Today. It's been a privilege to bring in these conversations. If you like this episode and have any feedback or comments, do mail me at inspiresomeonetodaypodcast@gmail.com. Inspiring someone is like creating ripples around us. If you like what you listen, feel free to share them and let's create ripples of inspiration. Do not forget to follow me on my Instagram handle @InspireSomeoneTodayPodcast for all the latest updates. This is Srikanth, your host, signing off, and until next time, keep inspiring.